And now, we return you to the musical Innertube, already in progress.
What is this thing? What's this podcast?
Welcome to the musical Innertube. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm Johnson Page.
We just talk to interesting people about interesting stuff.
Forward into the past!
Today, our topic is Firesign Theater, a four-man comedy collective, Phil Proctor, David Ossman, Peter Bergman, and Phil Boston, that started in the clubs and radio stations of late 1960s LA and went on to make a series of comedy albums stretching into the next century, which is ours, Mom. My sidekick Don Rooney and I spun Firesign Records on college radio back in the day, and we were at a lot of parties at which people would just sit around and recite whole Firesign albums, line by line, joke by hilarious joke, until we couldn't breathe for laughing. Our guest to help us celebrate Firesign is Jeremy Braddock.
He's no fun, he fell right over.
Author of the new book, Firesign, The Electromagnetic History of Everything as Told on 9 Comedy Albums. Welcome, Jeremy Braddock, to the musical Innertube.
Thanks, John.
So, Jeremy, as you can perhaps tell from the title of our podcast, there's much about what Don and I do that we do with thanks to the Firesign Theater. So my first question is about the way you've written the book and how you study Firesign. Many people would be surprised that a professor of literatures and English would study recordings and treat them almost as an archaeologist would. How is Firesign a material text, and how does thinking about it that way help?
They have such a fine attention to language that I think, I sort of grew up listening to the records, and Uncle gave me some of the records when I was about 12. And so, I kind of learned how to read, in a sense, as I was also listening to the records. And I think for the same reason that you and your friends could quote huge spans of the records from memory, it also tuned me to some things that language can do. So at a certain level, I knew that they were literary. They all have literary backgrounds in a way, David Ossman in particular. But I also felt like that it would really reduce what the records were about if I did a sort of standard literary reading, which is, what I was trained to do. At a certain point, I was where I teach Cornell University. It's a great big university in the middle of nowhere, so we really get to know people outside of our departments a lot. And so I began working with people in other disciplines who were working variously about media, and I realized that on those early Firesign records, they too are really thinking about different forms of media technology. And so it seemed to me that some sort of blend that accounted for the way they thought about language, but also the way that they both thought about, but also used different forms of media technology and cutting edge technologies, obsolete or forgotten forms of technology, seemed to be the way forward. And then as I worked, I also made a kind of third decision, which is also, in addition to having a history of the group, to try to make the book, I guess, for lack of a better word, kind of weird. Like I wanted to make it, in some ways, for it to read like the records sounded to me, which...
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So you can tell me if you think I did that, but that's what I was trying to do.
You did. I read it and I said, how weird is this?
Yeah, thanks.
Speaking of literary...
And Don's a weird guy. I just want to say, you should know.
Yeah, I have a couple of examples. I have the Big Mystery Joke Book and the Big Book of Plays, which I purchased as a Firesign fanatic, which tells you that they scripted everything they did. Those are scripts for what appeared on the records. However, they talk back and forth with each other, over each other, that sort of comes out of improv. And a lot of their radio stuff, especially in the early times when they were on the radio before they started making the albums, was indeed improv. So how did that improv help them get to a point where they could script it and it still sounded like they were coming off the top of their heads?
Yeah, great question. So Firesign came together on LA's Pacifica station KPFK in 1966. So there was a late night radio show that one of them hosted named Peter Bergman. And, they played music. People would phone in, but then at first informally and then more formally, the 4 future members of Firesign would come on and do riffs. And sometimes they would have written something, or sometimes it was just something that happened more or less spontaneously. So they had a radio program that went more or less irregularly from 66 to about 72, which is also the period of their really famous albums. And you can hear, especially in the like the late 60s, early 70s radio shows, which you can actually now buy in a collection called Duke of Madness Motors. If you really want to wade in and listen to all of these old radio shows, you can hear a lot of the ideas that later appear on the albums. Sometimes kind of directly. I think we're all bozos on this bus. There's a computer who's called Dr. Memory, and on all of the radio programs, they end the show with like a call out to Dr. Memory. So there's some kind of explicit ways in which they're working some of these things out. But then there's also ways where you can hear, like if you're completely geeked out, you can notice sort of punning ideas that appear later. Like there's one radio show in like 69 or 70 where there have recently been a spate of airline hijackings from the US to Cuba. And so they're sort of riffing on that. And someone says like, well, what if somebody did that to a school? And as you know from Don't Crush That Dwarf, Hand Me the Pliers, there is a school that disappears, which is something you can only do on radio.
Holy mudhead mackerel! More science high! It's disappeared!
Well, there's some other examples that I could give. So they would riff on the air, but then they would also have writing sessions. Like David Osman he was famously the typist. He would try to type as fast as they would speak, and he kept all the drafts, by the way. And that was one thing that really blew my mind, that I was able to go through successive drafts of the scripts before they were recorded. Your question was perfectly apt, because it was important that they both had the freedom to improvise, but then also to really hone and choose particular phrases. And one time when I was talking to Osman, he said, yeah, when we lost our radio show, that was big because you really needed to keep up your craft. And so there was a sense where there was actually something kind of musical or something about rehearsal, like you had to learn how to listen to things that were being said, which maybe even the person who was saying it didn't realize that they were saying. There was something about that interplay that was really important.
One side of the album, titled How Can You Be in Two Places at Once,
when you're not anywhere at all,
is sort of a potted history of America, in a way, where the question is asked, who am us anyway?
We're one of you, and you're one of us, I think.
Maybe. Possibly.
And it's delightful, and it's really funny, and it's them at their best in some ways. And I was just riffing right now about the kinds of media that you hear in there. Obviously, there's radio.
Radio work can be just as dirty and exciting as hunting down public enemy number one.
There's billboards where you see, advertisements for homes in the desert.
Shadow Valley condoms. If you lived here, you'd be home by now.
Telegraph.
Now we needed the hope, the faith, the prayers, the fears, the sweat, the pain, the boils, the tears, the broken bones, the broken home, the total degradation of
old radio shows like radio dramas. Obviously, that's going to be in the other side of that album, with a radio drama satirized as Nick Danger, Third Eye. But they're all in there. It's almost like a totalizing view of the entire media world in one.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one sort of important thing to know about them is that their audience were all folks who were in high school and college, during the late 60s, early 70s, but they were all a bit older. Like, they were not baby boomers. They were born in like late 30s to, I think Austin was born in 1940 or 41, which is to say they all grew up with radio and were young men as television came in. So they saw very clearly the continuity and the sort of the passage from one form to another. And of course, there were a lot of radio shows that became television shows like Gunsmoke and a lot of soap operas and stuff. So they knew that stuff really well. And another thing that's interesting is that stations like Pacifica did continue to play old radio from time to time. So it did continue to be available. I even remember, when I was a kid, my public radio station would play the Lone Ranger and stuff from time to time. So that it was supplanted by television very fast, but it didn't disappear right away.
We think of them mostly as radio guys because they were on the radio with radio shows, and most of their albums use the kind of background sounds and so forth that give that whole radio idea of theater of the mind. That's what I was going for there. When it comes to television, they didn't do much on television. When they do talk about television on their albums, they're very, very nasty.
Yeah.
They don't like television a lot, and they think it's very mind-numbing. And so it's very easy to figure out where they came from on that.
In fairness, I think they would have liked to have done television, and they do have a few things, like after Osmond leaves in the early 80s, they have a thing which I think you can find on YouTube called The Case of the Missing Yoke. It's like a late Nick Danger thing, and that's really pretty good. So I would recommend that. But yeah, I think that, let's put it this way, Don't Crush That Dwarf, Hand Me the Pliers has a lot to do with cinema and film, and they are making fun of it, of course, but there's also a certain reverence that they have, especially for the old comedians like, Buster Keaton and Hal Roach and so on. Whereas, like you said, they're much more caustic about television. But I think that my sense is that was a pretty common position to hold in the late 60s and early 70s, unless you were sort of doing a kind of Abby Hoffman thing, like you can't be a revolutionary without a television set sort of thing. But I think, even that point was, we need to take over television.
Yeah, and I think you point out something that existed then, which is very different now, which is that there was almost an impermeable, in other words, you couldn't break it, membrane between established media and acts like this that were thought to be countercultural, which was a term we don't use quite so much anymore.
Yeah.
All of that is broken down now. But it was hard for groups like that to actually get contracts for their work if you were thought to be underground. I can see why they would have trouble breaking in, if you know what I mean. And that's what people used to talk about, breaking into established media when you weren't established media. It was a difficulty.
On the other hand, they actually sold a lot of albums, which is, considering how quickly they kind of disappeared from the public eye, is a little surprising. But if you look at the old Billboard charts, the second, third, and fourth albums were all like well into the top 50, competing against Pink Floyd and stuff, right?
Yes.
So there was a sense in which they were listened to in the context of popular music, among other things.
Yeah. And as you say, they were older than their audience, but not by much, by maybe 5-10 years.
Yeah.
But they came to represent that time. The topics they tackled and the way they tackled them in the 60s and 70s, which was when John and I were taking in a lot of that, they were definitive in setting a mood and setting a revolutionary idea.
Well, why don't you guys talk about that a bit? Like, what's a topic that you found sort of strongly present on one or more of their records, and how did it change how you thought about it?
The one that I always go back to is two places. The first part is the guy buys a car, and suddenly it takes him into a completely different world, and that world has Nazis.
But in 1934, in Germany, the specter of doom was rising its shrouded head in agony.
And it has salespeople. Ralph Spoilsport of Spoilsport Motors.
Hiya, friends. Ralph Spoilsport Motors, the world's largest new used and used automobile dealership. Ralph Spoilsport Motors here in the city of Emphysema.
But then also, Bozos on the Bus gives us Disneyland that is all automated, and the president is automated.
Yeah.
Mr. President, I'd like to introduce you to...
Jim. Hi, Mr. President.
Hello. Always nice to see you.
Jim.
You know, the mainspring of this country, wound up as tight as it is guaranteed for the life of the watch.
I mean, that feeds into a lot of fears. Those two albums feed into a lot of fears that we had in the 70s that remarkably we have today. You could just take that president from Bozos and put AI in there, and you're right here.
So did you guys think that Nixon was automated? And if so, who was automating him?
Well, I will say that when in 1973 and 4, as Watergate, I mean, there was a huge struggle at the very beginning to see if it could be kept down, right? And it couldn't.
Yeah.
And it
took quite a while for it to...
Well, people, I don't think people can appreciate how long it took. Don's right that paranoia is a big topic in their records.
Yeah,
and they not only incorporate it as a theme that they work with, as Don has shown, they also make fun of the fact that everyone's talking about paranoia. So that there's sort of they didn't have this term back then, but there's a meta kind of thing where they often will do a thing with a topic, then make fun of people who do a thing with that topic, because everyone is doing a thing with that topic right now. So Paranoia is an excellent example. The Buffalo Springfield song, For What It's Worth. Paranoia strikes deep into your life, it will creep. That has to do with relations between kids on the street and the police, especially demonstrators. And all of that is cycled through a lot of their 70s albums. Relations with law enforcement and how dumb the police are.
Cop on the corner.
Ask the cop in the grocery store.
Ask the cop in the woodpile.
Ask the cop on the rooftop.
Ask that cop that's knocking at your back door.
And this was part and parcel of our cultural discourse, and they have a heck of a good time with it, while also sort of, I don't want to say stoking the fires. I think that they take it as a topic that needs discussion. Let's put it that way, because that's what satire does. It holds up a topic and, for inspection and usually criticism, either by the performers or by the audience after the performers are done with it.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. I think Don's quite right that that goes right through their work.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think that that record that Don mentioned, I think We're All Bozos on This Bus, is like one of the things that album is really about is surveillance. And they went into the studio like the month that the COINTEL program was revealed by the break-in in Media, Pennsylvania, which they were certainly aware of. But but it also strikes me, and I mean, maybe you can tell me if this rings true for you, but the fact that the records are so quotable meant that not only could you sort of lie on the floor of your basement and riff and I'll say one great trophy that I have is that the father of one of my colleagues here was a fan from back in the day, and he and a couple of his friends did a cover of the whole first side of How Can You Be in Two Places at Once, and he had a recording of it which he gave to me. So he did it with only 3 people. So that's one thing that you could do, but also one story that I heard a lot was that if you were hanging out with people who seemed simpatico maybe, or people that you're just learning, or you're in like a big group, you could just sort of drop a sly reference here and there, and it could be a way of establishing a sort of connection or having a sort of a code that you could, as if to say like are we cool? You know what I mean?
Right, that they were okay.
So how about that, Mr. Smarty Pants Communist, Mr. College Professor, Mr. Beatnik, Mr. Hippie? What have you done for me lately?
And one of the weird things, John and I go to a lot of ball games, and in the 7th inning since 9/11, they'll sing God Bless America. And when John and I would stand up and everybody was singing along with it, we'd look at each other and go, and the milkman white with foam.
God bless Vespucci land.
Which is one of the song, one of the phrases they sing in How Can You Be in Two Places at Once.
Ask the postman, ask the mailman. Yeah.
Ask the postman. Ask the mailman. Ask the milkman. White with foam.
The milkman, white with foam. Yeah. God bless Vespucci land.
And after a while, we kind of sang it a little softer because we started getting looks from people like, how can you be so unpatriotic? And so again, like I said, everything goes around, comes around.
Yeah, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, Jeremy, is how comedy that does not necessarily set out to be protest turns into protest because of its context. Marx Brothers were like this. They kept saying, well, we weren't making fun of war in Duck Soup. Well, yeah, you were. And everybody watches Duck Soup and they know, even Grouchy came around to this point of view and says, okay, we were, but we weren't making a big deal about it like they do today. He was trying to say that what we were doing was different from that. It wasn't protest.
But isn't Duck Soup like 1939 or 1940 or something
1933,
like that?
and they were listening
to,
during the filming, they were listening to radio broadcasts of translations of some of Hitler's speeches from Berlin. And this is before all the big stuff starts rolling.
That's
he had just come to power.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they would listen to it, and they'd have to wait for the steam to stop issuing from their ears. And then they went out and did To War We're Gonna Go scene. And of course, these are the forebears, especially in their patter and this incredible word association humor that the Firesign Theater especially revere, especially because Groucho and John Lennon are on the front cover.
Right.
That's the Marx and Lenin cover.
Right.
Groucho Marx and John Lennon.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Well, let's see if you think this answers your question. A few things come to mind. I mean, one, the first thing that I thought was that Duck Soup actually had a big revival during Vietnam, which you probably know. I actually saw it recently, in the last few years for the first time in decades, and I was completely blown away by, it was really funny, but quite haunting because it's so anarchic. And that really seems to be the point, that chaos is sometimes deliberately produced in the name of war. And so it's interesting to compare that to like The Great Dictator, which I guess is why I was thinking 1930, 1940, the Chaplin film, which is a great movie, but it's a little bit earnest, I would say. I think that Duck Soup has a lot more fire still. But so Firesign, they were all different varieties of left, but they definitely did not agree on things identically all the time. I wouldn't necessarily call them satirical in the way that we tend to think about satire, but I do think they were always political in some way. If they were asked about their politics, I think that they would have been evasive, because I think to have affirmed something would have, reduced the experience of listening to the record, because they are not only political, right? And they are not only satirical. There's tons going on, but also I think that they really did not want to produce works that could be described or encapsulated like in a sentence or two, which is something that you could do with The Great Dictator, I guess.
Right. They didn't want it to be programmatic. Yeah. They didn't want people to say, okay, so this is about that, which The Great Dictator, which it's a film that I love, but I totally take your point. It's got a point with a capital P, and
it's very moralistic, and it's a moralism that I support. But Duck Soup feels way edgier to me in 2026.
No, you don't understand how radio works. Now this is my flashback. All I have to do to return us to the present is fade my voice out like this and cue the organist.
Let's talk about what got you involved in it. You didn't get these albums until you were 12, and by that time, the albums were far in the past. So
by that time, I could speak and write and everything.
What made you decide that the Firesign was fodder for a book?
My parents were not baby boomers, but my mom's youngest brother was. So he was very totally of that generation. He didn't live nearby. I didn't know him that well. I know him much better now. But he gave me and my brother, we would have had How Can You Be in Two Places at Once and Don't Crush That Dwarf, and then that Nick Danger EP, the Case of the Missing Shoe, which is not so great, but we definitely had that. And then we had their last Columbia record, which is not as well known, but is now on all the streaming services, and I urge anybody to check it out, called In the Next World You're on Your Own. That record is amazing. They're the types of things where, you hear something different every single time. And we were big music heads as well, and we played music. I went to college. I majored in English, but I was also in college at a time where a discipline that's now called cultural studies was something that was developed in a certain way in Great Britain in the 70s and 80s at the Birmingham School, and it was being translated into certain forms in the US, and I had studied abroad for a year. So the short answer is that, cultural studies involved a lot of people who had been trained as literary critics. Other disciplines too, but English was always the biggest discipline, writing about things like, I don't know, toothpaste or whatever, writing about culture. And that made me think well, Firesign Theater really does deserve a book. But that was, 20 years before I started to write about it. And then the other thing was that I moved to California after graduating from college, and I read Greil Marcus's book, Lipstick Traces, which is dedicated to Firesign Theater. And that's clearly a book that is para-academic. It's an intellectual book, but it would not be a book that would get you tenure probably, but it's my favorite of his books still. And that made me think, maybe that might also be a model for writing about Firesign. As it turns out, he later said that he wrote it while only listening to Firesign Theater.
And this is Grail Marcus, the cultural and rock critic who made his mark in Rolling Stone and many other places.
And somebody said to me, well, you know, sometimes you can just call him up on the phone and he'll talk to you. So this was like 1994, and here's his number. And so I knew he was a Firesign fan. So I phoned him up nervously. And indeed, we did have a conversation, and he had contact info for Firesign, who had at that point reformed and eventually would record those albums that you had mentioned from the turn of the century. And
yes, and I love the 90s albums, by the way. They had a bit of a resurgence of sorts in the 90s for a lot of different reasons. I mean, this is humor that's sopping wet with culture, with whether it's the jokes about shoes.
Shoes for industry, shoes
for the dead. Yes, the shoe the shoe means so many different things in their comedy.
Shoes for industry, shoes for the dead, shoes for industry. Hi, I'm Joe Beats. Hey, what chance does a returning deceased war veteran have for that good-paying job, more sugar, and the free mule you've been dreaming of? Well, think it over. Then take off your shoes. Now you can see how increased spending opportunities means harder work for everyone, and more of it, too. So do your part today, Joe. Join with millions of your neighbors and turn in your shoes for industry.
Sure, and in that example, you can see the ways in which you can think about Firesign, like shoes for industry, shoes for the dead, take off your shoes for industry. Bergman had sort of studied labor economics in college and had actually written like a thesis on the Wobblies. And he knew that take off your shoes for industry was a slogan, I guess, of the Luddites. And the idea is like you would actually throw your shoes, the workers would throw their shoes into the gears of machine production to sabotage them. And that's where the word sabotage comes from. Like sabot is French for shoe. Listening to the records, not being from that generation, I was cued to pay attention to words when they actually, or terms when they actually appeared in their actual context later. So there's, on that last album from 75, there's a fake ad for Billy Jack dog food. and
Come and get it! Yes, those puppies are tearing into a tent full of Billy Jack dog food.
You know the dog food Billy Jack likes. And, it's like decades later where I learned about the film Billy Jack, which I'll let your listeners look it up if they don't know it, but it has to do with indigenous people's rights in the U.S. is definitely something that Firesign would have really noticed because they cared very deeply about those politics position. And
John and I, from the first side of How Can You Be in Two Places at Once, not only do we know the Milkman White with Foam, but we also know that they do a song about corn from the Indians.
Yeah.
They just basically talk about how the Indians were cheated out of everything in America.
Corn from the Indians, tobacco from the Indians, Dakota from the Indians, New Jersey from the Indians, New Hampshire from the Indians, New England from the Indians, New Delhi from the Indians.
Indonesia for the Indonesians!
Temporarily Humboldt County, one of their earliest pieces, was all about, the Indians. Oh, you're the great white person that's going to come and make everything good for us. And of course they come in and go, Domini, you're all Catholic, now get out of here. They're very, very intense on how we've mistreated the Indians.
Again, we're coming back to this notion that you can find so much in Firesign, and this is not even digging down. I mean,
yeah, we're not even scratching the surface here.
Jeremy, the amazing thing to me about you is that at age 12, not being of that moment, that you got to like this stuff because there had to be some getting up to speed. You had to do some deep dives to learn so much, maybe that's just because you are a scholarly inclined guy like myself, but I'm, I think it's amazing that you were able to do this kind of excavation.
Yeah, well, it's fun to be disoriented, I mean, it's fun to know that there's
That's what we say, Jeremy. That's why we have this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun to know that there's things that you need to learn about.
Well, Jeremy, we really, really love your book. Title is Firesign: The Electromagnetic History of Everything, as told on 9 comedy albums. Jeremy Braddock, we have had a ball. Thank you so much for being on the Musical Innertube.
Thanks so much for having me.
Why, she's no fun. She fell right over. Wait a minute. Didn't I say that line on the other side of the record?
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Send us an email at musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
Or log in to our website, musicalinnertube.com. and click on the microphone in the lower right-hand corner to leave us a voicemail.
And while you're on our website, take a few minutes to listen to past episodes of the podcast, along with pictures and biographies of our guests, blog posts, and lots more.
Our thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for providing us with our theme music.